By the mid-1960s, steam was in rapid retreat across the whole of British railways, and there were just a few pockets of steam operation left in the northwest of England. The railways didn't want steam to appear on their tracks anymore because it was old-fashioned. It didn't fit with the image of the modern railway that British Rail wanted to project.
The days of steam are rapidly coming to an end. A sad thought for small boys, perhaps, but a glad thought for most who welcome the diesel locomotive as steam's successor. The familiar sight of the overall-clad crew is being replaced. If not exactly white-collar workers, they can certainly dress in accordance with the relatively clean conditions the job now provides. Apart from greater efficiency, the diesel engine means a better life for the men who daily travel hundreds of miles, carrying you to all parts of the country. In the cab, for instance, are provided washing facilities, a far cry from the soot-caked conditions which for too long have been synonymous with a driver's life. There's the chance, too, to brew up before the long journeys. Instead of a footplate, there's a hot plate and a comfortable seat. The Deltic diesel, by the way, or on the way as it is now, is the most powerful locomotive in the world, capable of sustaining high speeds up to 100 miles an hour. Not that one particularly notices it, cushioned cosily in a compartment. Stations rush past, bridges disappear, miles melt away. The dynamic Deltic is part of the plan to make Britain's railways the world's best, and what a part it is playing. At this rate, the railway will soon be called the Speedway. But the Deltic, of course, is only part of the modernisation programme, typical of new ideas introduced daily in the race against time.
The Deltics were introduced in the early 1960s by the Eastern region, hauling the principal trains from King's Cross up to Edinburgh. And they were very successful in terms of maintaining that long-distance passenger business, largely because they were fast locomotives. They enabled the Eastern region to run trains at a maximum of 100 miles per hour, bringing down journey times. And although they were expensive locomotives to maintain, they were quite reliable as long as the maintenance regimes were followed strictly. So the operators were very happy with them. They were powerful, fast locomotives. The engineers might complain about how much it cost, but once they got a handle on these locomotives, they grew to quite like them too. And the commercial side were very, very happy because they were really the saviour of the Eastern region long-distance Anglo-Scottish trains in the very difficult trading conditions of the early 1960s.
This film, taken at London King's Cross Station, shows an interesting and varied collection of early British Railways diesel designs. Following the success of the Deltic prototype, the British Transport Commission placed an order in 1958 with English Electric for a fleet of 22 production models of a similar design. Construction was undertaken at Vulcan Foundry in Newton-le-Willows, where the first 2 locos were completed in January 1961. Each locomotive was fitted with 2 Napier Deltic engines, giving a total output of 3,300 horsepower. The smaller Class 23 Baby Deltics were not English Electric's most successful locomotives. They were all withdrawn for major rebuilding work in 1963. This greatly improved their performance, and the small fleet of 10 was allocated to Finsbury Depot, working trains from King's Cross to Hitchin, Peterborough and Cambridge. The Class 30-31 mixed traffic locomotives were built by Brush Electrical at their Falcon Works in Loughborough between 1957 and 1962. By 1964, their Merleys diesel engines had developed major problems due to fatigue, and many of the locos were refitted with English Electric diesel engines under a major 3-year programme of work.
British Railways' early experience of dieselisation wasn't a very happy one. They ordered too many diesels from too many manufacturers, and there wasn't enough time given to trying out the different types to find which ones were reliable. And the consequence was a lot of money was wasted. A lot of the early classes were very expensive to maintain, very expensive to operate, and didn't really last very long in service. But by the early 1960s, British Railways had learnt quite a lot of lessons from their earlier experience. And in 1962, a new type of locomotive, the Brush Type 4, later known as the Class 47, was introduced. And it turned out to be one of the most successful diesel locomotives to run on the national network. The Brush Type 4 was a go anywhere, do anything type of locomotive. Not only was it very successful from an operational and an engineering point of view, it was also very stylish, because British Railways was beginning to learn that the look of locomotives, the look of trains, the look of stations, in other words, the image of the railway was an important part of selling the idea of modernity, of selling the idea of the railway as an attractive form of transport to the public. And in the late 1950s, it had set up a design panel to review the look of locomotives and carriages and so on. And the Brush Type 4, the Class 47, was one of the first locomotives to be approved by the design panel. It was a very attractive, stylish locomotive, which even now, nearly 50 years later, still looks modern.
The Saltzer-powered Class 47s were another successful design from Brush Electrical at Loughborough. Construction of the first of the class was completed in September 1962. Following the success of the first batch of 20 locomotives, several repeat orders were placed by British Railways over the ensuing years. This saw the Class 47s in continual construction until early 1967, by which time 512 had been built, with the workload split between Brush's Falcon Works and the BR Works at Crewe. They formed BR's largest single class of mainline diesel locomotives and were used on passenger and freight trains across all the British Railways regions. Various updates and modifications were made to the Class 47s over the years, but with their excellent reliability beginning to decline with age, the first withdrawals of life-expired locomotives began in the mid-1980s. A significant number of the locos did, however, survive into the privatisation era of the 1990s, finding use in the freight sector, with companies such as EWS and Freightliner, as well as the passenger lease companies.
By the early 1960s, the British Transport Commission was a rather different animal from the organisation that had been set up in 1948. It wasn't to last much longer, because by this time the railways were in very severe financial difficulties indeed. They were making large losses, running into millions of pounds every year, and the Conservative government decided that something had to be done about this. And what it did was appointed a man who is famous or infamous within the railway industry, Richard Beeching from ICI, the big chemical giant. He was basically charged with seeing what could be done about making the railways lose less money, not necessarily make a profit, but at least not lose as much money as they had been doing. And one of the decisions which the government made, partly on Beeching's advice, although I think it had already really made the decision itself, was to separate all the different modes of transport that had been nationalised, those that remained nationalised in the early 1960s, and create bodies which were responsible for each individual mode. So the railways, for the first time, were to be run by an organisation which was only responsible for the railways and nothing else. And that new organisation was the British Railways Board, and Beeching became its first chair. Now, Richard Beeching's report, The Reshaping of British Railways, published in 1963, was a major bombshell. It advocated widespread closures of railway lines, withdrawal of many local and stopping passenger services, and also the withdrawal of freight facilities from a lot of stations and depots. Many people within the railway industry had been saying for some years that something like Beeching needed to be done, that the railway couldn't continue to operate in the late 50s and the 1960s in the ways that it had done, largely unchanged since the late 19th century. And I think that in general terms that was a sensible way of looking at things. Road competition by now was much, much stronger. Many of the railway's traditional services, such as the station-to-station pickup goods train, the branch line train, the local stopping train, were losing huge sums of money. And even if one could argue, and I do argue this, that sometimes it is justifiable to operate services at a financial loss because of the wider benefits that the railways bring to the public in terms of better safety, reduced pollution and so on. Even bearing all that in mind, it seems clear to me that many of those services were racking up such huge losses that they really could not be justified. So I'm afraid, despite being a railway historian, despite being somebody who enjoys travelling by train, that I think generally speaking Beeching was right, and that his report identified correctly many of the problems with the railway of the early 1960s. Some of the detail was wrong. Some railways were closed which probably shouldn't have been closed, even given predominant views at the time. And I think where there was a real failure was in the reluctance to safeguard the actual route, the actual track bed of some of the more important secondary lines that were built, because under the very changed circumstances 40 years later, I think we'd love to have some of those railway routes available to us now, because almost certainly we'd want to put back trains on some of those lines, and now it will be almost impossible to do that because they've been built on and effectively lost.
The railwaymen themselves are now faced with this prospect of another 70,000 jobs being lost to this industry. Do you believe that they'll go along with you in this plan?
I think they can. I don't think that they will put their heads in the sand and keep them there. I think that these proposals are in the long-term interests of railwaymen. I think they'll go along with us, but it does present them with a very great difficulty.
I think the Beeching era would take probably a major series of these tapes several years to bottom out, and even then we wouldn't necessarily agree. I've heard enthusiasts say that Beeching was one of the great railway enthusiasts. Whether or not he did the right thing depends on whether or not you think he was asked the right questions. I think there is no doubt that he did what he was asked to do, or he answered the questions he was asked. There's no doubt that particularly the later Victorian lines, some of the last ones to be built after, say, about 1870, fewer and fewer of those could ever make economic sense. And certainly once 2 world wars had accelerated the development of the petrol engine, they could never make economic sense while you still had the petrol engine. We did have a network that got just about within shouting distance of every hamlet in the country, and would have provided, had it lasted through to the 21st century, really only 50 years within a railway history that is of the powered railway 200 years. So it had 150 years, all went better, okay, then it all went pear-shaped, and now we are desperately missing it, environmentally, socially, and everything else. And so from the wider picture, I think it has to be seen as a disaster.
There were other important railway strikes, perhaps one of the most interesting being one in the early 1960s called by the National Union of Railwaymen in protest at aspects of Dr. Richard Beeching's plans for the railways. Now, when you say this, people tend to assume that it must have been Beeching's proposals to close a large number of branch lines and withdraw lots of passenger services that the NUR was protesting about, but in fact it wasn't. There was no real opposition from the trades unions on that score. But the union did object to Beeching's proposals to radically reduce the number of railway workshops that the railways operated and maintained, with consequential large number of job losses. And it was a fairly successful strike, not in the sense that Beeching reversed his plans, which he didn't, because quite clearly with the transition from steam traction to electric and diesel traction, one simply didn't need as many workshops and as many people to maintain the new forms of traction. But Beeching did slow down the rate at which the workshops were closed and offered more favourable severance terms to the workers, which allowed for a smoother transition to the new regime.
The worst thing of the Beeching era was it set this negative feeling in the government's mind that you shouldn't invest in the railways, and I think Beeching was probably right to shut some of the branch lines. You don't have to keep every single 19th century branch line in the 20th century, but it gave the government the idea that no investment in the railway was right, and a more balanced portfolio would have been to have shut some of the branch lines, but to have invested in more four-tracking of the main lines, and most certainly in providing flyovers at places like Hitchin, where the Cambridge line still crosses the East Coast main line on the flat, at Woking, where the Portsmouth line crosses all four tracks of a southwestern, and above all at Reading. And it's those conflicts we should have been investing in, and I think that's the indictment of the government in the 70s.
Say railway, think of Beeching. But what do names like the Countess, Ken Nelson, Bob Harris and Laurie Brooks signify? Well, they're all involved in a railway at Welshpool, a railway which is actually reopening. The rebirth of this narrow gauge line in mid-Wales brings a gleam of optimism into the ominous picture outlined by the Beeching plan. Thanks to the local light railway preservation company, a new passenger service will be operating at weekends. If the Beeching axe falls, this will be the only steam service left in an area sadly short of trains.
I think of the best way of describing how I got involved with Beeching, it was really due to the fact that I was appointed as a part-time member of the Eastern Area Board. That's the area board of the British Transport Commission, as it was in those days. So I was really sort of part and parcel of the organisation. When it came to the point when I had purchased Flying Scotsman to make sure that it didn't go the way of so many others to the knacker's yard, it very much came to Beeching's notice, and he felt that as a part-time board member it was not the right sort of image to be propagating. They were frightfully keen on the use of this word image in those days, and if you didn't present the right image of this, that or the other, you were inclined to be in trouble. And I was in very big trouble indeed, and Beeching simply took the view that purchasing particularly a very well-known steam locomotive was conveying quite the wrong message. Well, I got very hot round the collar about this and thought I was being very badly done by. But of course, as the years go by, I can see that the poor man had a point. I mean, he again was being attacked by all and sundry in various sections of the press for this, that and the other things he was doing and things he was not doing. And I don't know really that he had a great deal of option, but from my point of view it was a blow. I thoroughly enjoyed being part of the establishment, if you like. And I was very cross when he told me that I was being dropped from the board. So there we go. At a time, for a time, I was very annoyed about it, and I think I probably made my feelings extremely clear to a lot of my friends. But again, I say, over the years I can see that the poor man had got a problem.
All of the A3s built by the LNER in the 1920s survived into British Railways ownership, and it was not until 1959 that the first of the class was withdrawn from service. Flying Scotsman was withdrawn from King's Cross Shed in January 1963 and subsequently bought by Alan Pegler. Under the terms of BR's deal with Alan Pegler, the engine was overhauled at Doncaster Works and repainted into LNER apple green livery. Throughout the 1960s, Flying Scotsman was a regular sight around the British Railways network, as the engine worked a busy schedule of steam enthusiast excursion trains. This continued until 1969, when Flying Scotsman embarked on its ill-fated tour of the United States and Canada, an expedition that was to end in bankruptcy, with the locomotive stranded in San Francisco.
I think the interesting element about early pioneering preservation is that ultimately someone had to do it. It's very interesting that immediately after the war, despite shortages, austerity, lack of money and so on, that a lot of people started to see the same thing happening, that the world was actually changing faster and faster. Maybe it had just become more unpleasant. You know, people have invented the nuclear weapon, they just had a horrible world war. People started to look backwards for right or wrong. So you got people like Rolt preserving the Talith Linn, you got simultaneously people preserving the first traction engines, veteran cars, all these things. In terms of what people like Alan Pegler did, was to ratchet the whole thing up to an unimagined height, that you got Bill Smith buying 1247, little Great Northern tank. Well, you could almost, if you budge the wheels in, get it on narrow gauge. You couldn't do that with this. So what Alan Pegler did is say, no, we really do like this stuff so much, we're actually going to go out and buy it. Because until then, you had things like Stevenson Locomotive Society preserving Gladstone years earlier, but very much in a case of this is an extraordinary thing to do and we're going to put it in a museum. But to actually say, I'm a private individual, not a railwayman, but I love this stuff so much, I'm going to put my money where my mouth is. Instead of just collecting tickets and taking photographs and collecting numbers, I'm going to collect the whole damn engine. And the sooner someone did that, it kind of broke the dam, and everyone else could start saying, oh, I'm going to do that. Why not? So you got, you end up with these lovely, lovely things in his book of David Shepherd sort of ringing up BR and saying, I've just sold a load of paintings. I want a 9F as well. Great. I wish we'd all done it.
I applied to join British Rail in 1965, and it was a strange time to be applying. The government had said there was no future in railways, future was in roads, and they were going to build all our motorways, and they were going to cut the railways by about 40%, which they did, and they saw the future of rail as bleak. But I'd also noticed there was a second Beeching report, which we all tend to forget, where he said there were certain areas where the government should invest in rail, and he said he wanted to develop something called Intercity. Intercity was going to be the new long-distance passenger services, modernised. He talked about merry-go-round coal trains, where you could load and unload coal trains at power stations without stopping, and container trains called today freightliners. So he did actually bring into existence Intercity, freightliners and merry-go-round, and I felt that was the positive area which attracted me into the industry.
New British Railways uniforms to herald new standards in passenger comfort. They call it the Train of Tomorrow. 8 specially built coaches, diesel-powered, and demonstrated for us during a run from London. Easier to get on and get off thanks to the wide folding doors, the train is going into service in different parts of the country and passengers will be asked for their reactions.
The new train will be hauled on the London-Edinburgh route by a diesel-electric locomotive of 2,750 horsepower. Old-fashioned courtesy, as XP64 leaves Marylebone on a demonstration run to High Wycombe and back. Aiming at maximum passenger comfort, the designers consulted medical experts. Glare can be banished without gloom taking its place, and forced air ventilation pleases everybody. They say the lighting is pretty well perfect.
A smoother, quieter ride, big panoramic windows with blinds if you feel like a snooze, and partial double glazing too. In fact, it's British Railway's formula for attracting travellers back to trains. They're claimed to be among the best designed coaches in the world.
Up for auction at Southport's Chapel Street station, around 400 relics from the past. Relics from the brass-bound age of steam. Victoriana, Edwardiana, redolent of all the romance of the old railways. None of it exactly given away. You could pay up to £25 for one of the more elaborate lamps. How about this above your mantelpiece? Satisfied customers were buying more than just an old bit of railway furniture. They bought a little piece of the past.
Historically, the last days of steam in this country are something that we're going to have to study for years to really make sense of it. On the one hand, we had a modernisation programme committed not just to modernisation, whatever that actually meant, but to dieselisation as part of that shaking off an older image.
By the end of standard gauge steam on British railways in August 1968, over 16,000 locomotives have been withdrawn and scrapped in just under 10 years. Some were disposed of by BR themselves in their own works, as seen in these shots. But with a team of 2 men taking about a week to cut up a locomotive, the sheer numbers of engines being withdrawn from service meant that the railway's own workshops couldn't cope. This resulted in many thousands of steam engines being sold to private scrapyards across the country for breaking up. The first region of British Railways which was to completely lose all of its steam traction was to be the Western region. The newsreel cameras were in action at Paddington Station on the 11th of June 1965 to record the historic departure of the last public steam train to depart from Paddington. By the end of 1965, steam had completely disappeared from the Western region.
The southern region was a railway of 2 halves. We often think of the southern as being all about electric trains in and out of London on the suburban services, but there was another southern railway, another southern region down in the West Country, a railway of rambling branch lines and slow steam-hauled trains that staggered on into the 1960s. And that railway disappeared as part of the Beeching era cuts, and with it the steam trains.
This Southern Counties Touring Society Enthusiast Special on the 3rd of October 1965 provided the opportunity of travelling by steam one last time on the route from London Waterloo to Ilfracombe and Torrington via Exeter and Barnstaple. Steam-hauled passenger train services had been withdrawn from the Ilfracombe branch the previous year. The replacement diesel service would last until 1970. In the same few years, the area also lost the 2 major North Cornwall lines, Horwell Junction to Bude and Meldon Junction to Launceston, Weybridge and Padstow. Another major loss in Devon was the Southern's route across the north of Dartmoor from Exeter to Plymouth via Oakhampton and Tavistock.
Well, the personal feeling, of course, were very much of regret. I mean, I very much regretted being part of the organisation that was doing all they could to get rid of steam as quickly as possible. And from that point of view, it was to me very sad. But in terms of whether it was right to do this or not, you can't really do anything else. I mean, if they're having decided that the policy was going to be to replace steam with diesel and electric, there isn't really a halfway house, I don't think. And of course the idea originally had been that they would have certain locomotives preserved, none of them incidentally as in running order, that wasn't the idea at all, but they could be preserved as museum pieces if they had particular relevance to the history of the railways. And so that was duly done. And of course again, jumping forward to, to Beeching and one thing and another, his reaction to my saying that I wanted to keep the thing running, that was not in anybody's book at all. And the unfortunate chap who was in charge of what is now the National Railway Museum, a chap called John Scholes, I got to know him quite well, picked his brains over buying the Festiniog Railway and was it worth preserving and all the rest of it. But one way and another it was all a very tricky time indeed, and having decided that replacing with diesel and electric, I think there was no turning back. The trouble is that it all comes down to manpower and the cost and everything else. Everything comes back to that word cost. And it would have been awfully nice to keep a lot of these smaller stations open, but if you're not taking any passengers or not earning any revenue in this day and age, and even 40 years ago for that matter, it did matter. And people took it very seriously. And so I suppose with the best will in the world, if one couldn't really say you could do anything else. But it's a great shame, I think, that it did happen like that.
Over 100 years of railway history came to an end over the weekend of the 5th and 6th of March 1966, as sightseers and enthusiasts bid a fond farewell to the Somerset and Dorset Railway. At a crowded Bath Green Park station, the last scheduled departure was sent on its way amidst a barrage of exploding detonators. At Evercreech, the junction for the S&D's branch to Highbridge, the station master Alexander Stowe led a group of members of his staff paying their final tribute to the railway they loved. For many of the workers along the line, the routines of years are gone through for the last time, no doubt recalling memories of their working life on the Somerset and Dorset, a railway which had very much of a family feeling amongst the staff. With no service trains on the final Sunday, it was the turn of the locomotive clubs, which ran several enthusiast specials that day. There had been hopes that the S&D, along with many lines around the country listed for closure by Richard Beeching, would be saved when a new Labour government came into power in 1964, led by Harold Wilson, replacing the Conservative administration which had been in power since 1951. The previous Minister of Transport, Ernest Marples, the man who installed Beeching as chairman of the British Railways Board, was now gone. Marples, who owned his own civil engineering company, was viewed as someone very much in favour of a huge expansion in road construction, and with not much interest in the future of railways. Sadly, Labour's promise during the election campaign to put an end to railway cutbacks came to nothing when in 1965 it was announced by the new Transport Secretary, Barbara Castle, that the Somerset and Dorset would still be closed. Indeed, the majority of closures recommended by Beeching that did actually take place were carried out during the years of Wilson's Labour government. The weekend wasn't without incident. At Evercreech, the signal box had been set alight by arsonists just a few hours after the last trains had run the previous evening. So in the finest traditions of the Somerset and Dorset, it called for a little ingenuity on the part of the men from the signal and telegraph department to keep the trains running to the end.
One of the things that Dr. Beeching brought to the railways was a determination to start charging for freight services based more or less on the cost of providing those services. Only if you know how much it's going to cost you to move several tons of steel from the steelworks to wherever it's needed can you then charge the trader enough money to make sure that you make a profit on the deal. The railways hadn't done that really until Beeching came into the picture, and when he introduced the new approach to handling freight in the early 1960s, he did encourage, indeed he required the railways to put up prices on some types of service, some types of freight service, to the point where it was too expensive for the traders, and in that sense the railways were pricing business off the rails, but doing it quite deliberately. Beeching brought a new awareness of costs to the railway, and on the freight side the downside was that a lot of traditional traffic was priced off the railways because it was realised that the railways was making huge loss on these flows. The upside was that Beeching helped railway managers identify those flows which either were already profitable or could be made even more profitable by introducing new methods of working. And one example of a very successful innovation was the so-called merry-go-round train, designed to carry coal from the pit head to large coal-fired power stations. Innovative because it used new high-capacity wagons designed to operate continuously, very high utilisation, so you were using the capital intensively, using labour intensively. The railways struck some very good deals with the National Coal Board. Both sides were happy because they were both gaining. Very profitable flows for the railway, and those merry-go-round trains still operate today. Other innovations were not quite as successful. Freightliner was a good idea, building on the success the big four companies had had between the wars in developing container traffic. The advantage with the container is that it's easy to transship from road to rail and back again. It's flexible, less damage caused to goods because you're not continually moving goods, not having to repackage them and so on and so forth, less pilferage, so on and so forth. So Beeching took that old idea and again encouraged the railways to think about ways in which it could be improved with bigger containers, longer traffic flows, so on and so forth. Freightliner was quite successful, but never made the sorts of sums that had been hoped for it in the 1960s. It did come into its own many years later with the huge worldwide explosion in the use of containers for maritime transport. Indeed, many of the containers that you see on the railways today are being hauled from ports, either to other ports or to inland ports. So Freightliner today is a successful business, but it was a long time before it became successful. The changing economy meant that there were new opportunities for the railways, though, when it came to moving freight. And just as on the one hand the rise of mass motoring was threatening British Railways' long-distance passenger traffic, it also meant that there were opportunities there on the freight side to move cars by rail.
Much use of car flats was used for transporting new cars and commercial vehicles. These were flat wagons with a timbered deck and were built using redundant coach chassis. Converted four-wheeled ferry vans were also used for the transportation of motor vehicle parts and spares, and in particular engines. Here, special double-deck cradles are used on flat wagons for the inter-factory transportation of pressed steel car bodies for the Roots Group, which had factories at Linwood near Glasgow and in the West Midlands at Coventry. Articulated double-deck wagons were introduced in 1964 in a joint project between British Railways and the Ford Motor Company.
Another lucrative business for the railway was parcels traffic, which was often carried by passenger trains, and it brought in a good deal of revenue. But again, the problem the railways faced were ever-increasing labour costs, and mechanisation was an important way of trying to reduce costs and maintain a profitable business to the railways in the 1960s.
These scenes, filmed at Euston Station's parcels depot, give an indication of the amount of investment in new equipment undertaken by British Railways in the 1960s to modernise the service. Railway parcels were handed in by customers at an office on their local passenger station. In 1963, BR had set up Red Star, a service for carrying high-value registered parcels from station to station in the guards compartment of express passenger trains. Entire trains of parcels vans were operated between the major stations, and many cities had dedicated parcels depots. By the late 1960s, the railways were operating nearly 10,000 motor vehicles for parcels and goods deliveries. A familiar sight for decades on railway stations around the country were the piles of mail bags being trundled around the platforms on four-wheeled wooden trolleys. These were found around the entire railway network, but were originally designed for carrying passengers' luggage.
British Rail have just announced a service that's even faster than flying. When they introduce it next April between London and Manchester, it'll be nearly half an hour faster than the intercity airlines. The secret's electrification, but speed isn't restricted to long-distance routes. These new suburban trains will be running from Euston in 3 months' time. Up to 75 miles an hour, with a threepenny bit as undisturbed as the passengers. Smooth, comfortable travel between London and the outer suburbs, which will link up with the long-distance line to Birmingham and Liverpool.
One of the major modernisation projects of the 1955 plan was the electrification of the West Coast main line, which was preferred over the alternative of electrifying the East Coast main line to Scotland.
Introducing you to the newest type of electric loco for British Railways. At Sandbach in Cheshire, Lord Chandos, for the makers, handed over a key to Lord Rusholme, Chairman London Midland area, and contact is made between engine and overhead cables. Then the driver takes out this very important loco, which marks a big step forward in the British Railways modernisation plan. It's the first of the engines for the mainline electrification between London, Manchester and Liverpool. Designed to haul a 475-ton passenger train at 100 miles an hour. Promising railway news. In fact, you could say it's electrifying.
Now, the West Coast Main Line was a huge project. It's one of the busiest railways in the country. It has lots of different branches of it, which had to be electrified at the same time. It serves some of the major, principal cities in the United Kingdom: London, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow. So it was very, very important to keep the trains running whilst the track was being electrified.
While in service, checkups have to be carried out on such aspects as the electrified overhead wires with the aid of this remarkable gondola car. From this mobile laboratory, with its pantograph and other test equipment, engineers can inspect variation in height, wear and endurance under high-speed conditions. new equipment, new ideas, and most important of all, a new spirit of determination to ensure that our railways will soon once again beat the world.
What we hadn't noticed, of course, was in Japan they were just starting to produce the bullet trains, which are going to be travelling at 185 miles an hour. And whilst Britain did the job well, we missed out on that big leap forward which Japan took at that time. I think by then Beeching had left, and we were starting to see his intercity legacy taking place, and the West Coast was the one line in Great Britain which had been really well modernised. All the track had been renewed, it had been re-signalled, we had the new electrification south of Crewe, and there was a tremendous sense that let's show the world that railways can still work in Britain.
British Rail is switched on for tomorrow, switched on for the fastest service in railway history between London, Manchester and Liverpool. Their new all-electric service cuts journey time by almost an hour between Manchester and the capital. They've spent 175 million on this modernisation, which aims to entice many more travellers back to the railways because the service is cheaper and faster than any alternative. The track is welded in extra long sections, giving a smooth, quiet ride. No speed restrictions like the 70-mile limit on the M1. This is a ton-up service which averages around 85 and frequently exceeds 100 miles an hour.
For driver Graham and his colleagues on the express routes, new electric locomotives capable of sustained high speeds will enable them to complete the journey between London and the northern cities in 2.5 hours. The overhead electrification system has cost £175 million. It is one of the most modern of its kind in the world, incorporating signal boxes with equipment that wouldn't look out of place at Cape Kennedy. Passenger comfort has also been given priority with new coaches, restaurant cars and sleeping accommodation rolling on continuous welded rail to give a smoother, more silent ride. From the driver's viewpoint, this is what it looks like up front at 100 miles an hour.
Technically, in engineering terms, the new standard 25,000 volt electric locomotives were, for the most part, pretty reliable. Ran day in, day out at 100 miles per hour. Passengers like the new service, they like the cleanliness, they like the speed, they like the frequency of the trains. Although the scheme had cost a lot of money to develop, the returns in terms of fares were very, very encouraging, and it was widely and I think rightly regarded as a success story, despite all the problems.
I have the honour of having helped to modernise the West Coast Main Line twice, in 1966 as a management trainee and in 2004 as the retiring chief executive of Virgin Trains, and both periods have been highly frustrating, but the results have been good. In 1966 I was watching the railway being modernised as a trainee, but then one of my first jobs was as an assistant passenger manager in Birmingham, where the job was to fill the new trains, and we had a lot of freedom in developing cheap fare tickets, promoting the new railway, getting groups to travel, and I think we were pretty successful then. The train operation was very good, it was a modern railway, and we doubled the number of passengers in about 5 years, confounding the critics who said there was no future in rail and we should only be thinking about motorways. So we were all pretty proud of that in the late 60s.
Derby, centre of British Rail research. Here in this £4 million technical centre, British Rail concentrates all its design, research and development work. This is a test rig to study hunting, the swaying that affects rolling stock at certain speeds. Derby, they design out this hunting effect to ensure smooth running. In this case, they're working on a rail wagon for high-speed liner trains.
Transport Minister Barbara Castle, escorted by the chairman of the British Railways Board and other high-ups, visited the Railway Technical Centre and toured the workshops. Half of British Railways' new carriages are manufactured here. A welder's eye view now. Not easy without deranging the hairdo. Railway research, design and development never stop. A test here of wheel adhesion. Greater comfort and safety result from the work of the backroom men. 99 Freightliner containers have been produced so far this year. They're ready for service now that union opposition is withdrawn. To remember her visit, Mrs. Castle received a model from an apprentice who comes from Blackburn, her constituency.